Like, why was this paper published on ArcSiv? Because every other form of publishing mechanism is sclerotic, it's establishment, it's hierarchical, it's about people basically dominating their own little forms of payola, right? And so Nature, JAMA, all of this stuff works this way. And so what happens? You don't get fundamental innovations that happen in labs. You have things that feed research proposals, that feed people who need to basically establish their supremacy. You saw the Stanford professor get booted out because of stuff that, the
president of Stanford.
The president of Stanford. So why is all this happening? Well, Peter is right. The reason why this stuff is happening is that instead of places where true fundamental innovation can happen, if you look at the Nobel Prize winners and you do distribution by age, what do you find? People win Nobels in their 60s for work that they did in their 20s and 30s, right? And so you have a system now that rewards people staying in their positions. I wrote this in one of my annual letters. If you look at the average age of like leading people in schools, they're like 70 years old. If you look inside of Congress. So there's all of this stuff that just kind of sclerotically prevents young, naive people from basically going out and really pushing the boundaries in specifically this case of science, of fundamental science. And so for every innovation, I think the question to ask is, what other innovations are we missing? And if innovations are on a fundamentally well-established pathway that defends a bunch of work of senior people before it, it'll get supported. And I would say that genetics is a perfect example of that. If you look at the number of rare diseases that are still like unsolved, or the lack of understanding of immunodisease, it's just crazy. I just think that that's really what's happening. I think Peter's more right than he's wrong.
The other issue here, Sachs, is, and I'd like to get your feedback on this, is if you look at how venture capital works, you got a 10-year window. You want to get returns for your LPs. You look at how this fundamental research, we just said this started in 1999. That's why it's called -99. This thing took 25 years to get to this point. Is part of this issue that you have this big opportunity zone between, say, ventures window, 10 years, and then academia, which you put at like 4 decades there, Chamath, 20 year olds getting their rewards in their 60s. How much of this has to do with we don't have a platform in between venture and academia?
That's not the problem. I mean, so it's true that VC funding, typically you want to go to the commercialization of an idea, and that the underlying platform shift already exists. And usually that comes from some sort of breakthrough that happened in academia. I mean, that's basically what happened with the internet. So yeah, you do not want VC funding typically going to basic R&D, fundamental science R&D. It's just really expensive, takes too long, and too unknown. So you want that stuff kind of done more at the academic level. The question I have is how much of what's happening in academia is basically either irrelevant or fraudulent? So Chamath, you brought up the Stanford president. I think the story there is he had 5 papers about Alzheimer's research and related topics like that, where they found out that the papers are basically bogus and quasi-fraudulent. So how much of the work that's being done in academia, how many of these papers are basically bogus?
Well, the thing with peer review is it's presented like it's a great, incredible solution to the world's problems. But I think what it has inherently wrong with it. So the positive part of it is theoretically you have error correction, right? But here, what you don't find is that error correction actually even happened. And so it takes some young 20-year-old kid at Stanford who's a journalist, whose family were journalists, to basically figure that out. So instead, what were those papers doing? They were supporting a rising up and coming person because they thought that, he would support them at some point.
This is like the whole corrupt Fauci system at the NIH.
What do you think, Friedberg? Chamath and Sachs are presenting academia as corrupt. Do you agree with that?
I don't know if corrupt is the right term because I think that implies malintent. I think that the incentives are wrong. So in order to get funded, you have to show results. No one gets a grant to disprove someone else's work. No one gets a grant to do confirmatory work on someone else's work. You get a grant, I mean, that's the argument that some folks make. You get a grant to do breakthrough research and have breakthroughs. And if you have breakthroughs, you get more money. That's the way the system is set up. But this is why let me just finish.
I think it's corrupt. I think it's corrupt.
There's no funding breakthroughs. Come on.
Okay, whatever you want to define it as, the guy at Stanford, if you read some of the testimony from people in his labs, they said that he encouraged people to have big findings. And if you get big findings, you get to progress in the organization, you get more funding, et cetera. So the incentive structure that he set up for people was not necessarily to go in and disprove stuff or try something and show that it didn't work. If you try something and show that it didn't work and publish a paper on that, it's going to be very hard for you to turn around and get a trophy or get some money or get a grant.
That's not what he did. There was like a bunch of error in the data that they went back and were like, hey, this was incorrect. And he's like, oh yeah, it was sloppy. I just didn't do a good job of reviewing it.
So what happened was, if you read some of the testimony, the people that worked in his labs, the students and the graduate students and so on, they said that he basically encouraged people to get good results. And in that process and in that way, there was some fuzziness in the data or some tweaking of the data that he didn't double check for sure. But he was encouraging this sort of system of performance. And the system of performance says you've got to show results. You can't show non-results. And if you show non-results, there's no money.
And the reason they're doing that is marketing. They want to market and get more attention so they get more donations.
Yeah, exactly. The problem with pure research is that you have to get funding to do your research. Where do you get your funding from? You get your funding from federal agencies, from nonprofits, from your donors. And so in order to get that money, you have to say, here's what I'm going to do. You don't say, I'm going to go not prove something. You say, I'm going to go prove something.
No, but hold on. You're hiding the cheese. Can you stop hiding the cheese? That's not what these people are saying. These people aren't saying, I'm not going to not prove this. Most of these people are working on very thin incremental extensions of work that's already been done because it allows them a more defined path to get tenureship, to be a well-respected professor, to work through the hierarchy of a university. That's what's happening today. And the reason why that stuff gets funded is that those are the same people that are in charge of the funding infrastructure at NIH and all these other places. What we don't have is something that says, go and write the most ambitious proposals and I'm going to go fund it.
Yeah, I think both things are true.
There's no market mechanism.
I'll just say both things are true because what you're saying, Chamath, is a point of failure. If you say, I'm going to go try something crazy, like do a search for a room temperature superconductor using lead crystals, you're not going to get funding for that. It's too out there. I mean, you guys today are talking about how low probability stuff isn't that interesting. I'm not going to fund it until it's real. And so when things are real, you have some molecule that has some effect on cancer cells, then you get funding to make that molecule go to the next phase or go to the next stage. That is more fundable than the outlandish crazy thing where the probability of it going to zero is 99%.
You could throw Elizabeth Holmes into that, right? I mean, she came up with this absurd idea that she could do 200 tests on one drop of blood. And
that wasn't even pure research. That was just a statement about engineering that wasn't ready and wasn't possible.
Another company just got funded to do the same thing that Theranos promised it was going to do. Yeah. Did you see this? But I
did not see that. No.
Yeah. I mean, some pretty good VCs invested in it, actually. And they expressly said, we know this is the same idea as Theranos, but for that very reason, we think it's very unlikely to be fraud because it's being held to such a high standard of scrutiny.
I want you guys to think about this. I want you guys to think about this as VCs. An entrepreneur comes to you. And the entrepreneur, she says, I've done this thing, I did this thing, I did this thing, I did this thing, I did this thing. 5 different things, none of them worked. I want to have money to do this next thing. You're less likely to fund that person than the entrepreneur that shows up and says, this first thing I did worked, the second thing I did worked, the third startup I did worked. They weren't home runs, but they worked
have the opposite.
And I had good results. That's basically what happens in the scientific research is you've got to get something that's fundable. And often that means not doing something that's likely to go to zero. And that's where the incrementalism comes in, Chamath, is that orientation, I think.
I think smart, independent thinkers find ways to make money. I've been looking at this superconductor space for the last 2 years. And so it's not like people are shy and have money and aren't willing to write the checks. I just don't think that's what it is. The body of work that's coming out of academic institutions today for the amount of money that's put in is modest. And I think that's the best way to describe it. It's the fairest way. And the reason it's modest is not because of the intellectual capacity of the people. It's because of the incentives and the hierarchy and the establishment elitist politics that infuses how these organizations are run. And I think the only way to break that apart is to basically disrupt who is in charge of these institutions. Nick, just throw up this chart. These are people that for decades and decades and decades are in a grind and who are now in control. And so what is the incentive of these folks to
explain the
change?
Yeah, what is this?
this is a chart that I put together, which is just the generational distribution of academic leadership across all the leading research institutions in America. Okay.
Well, isn't Fauci a prime example of this?
The birth year?
No, listen, you had the most important person, hold on a second, the most important person probably in the federal distribution of grants in the medical field was Fauci, right? He literally was running the NIH since the 1980s. He's been there for 40-something years. And the mask was peeled away during COVID, and we saw how much power he wielded, really, I think, in a corrupt way. Jason used the word corrupt. You had that letter to the Lancet that he got a whole bunch of scientists to sign that claimed that COVID was not made in a lab. That was a conspiracy theory, that the only place it could have come from was the sort of the zoonotic leap naturally occurring from animals. We know that he used his power over grants to basically pressure those people into signing the letter, or they thought it would be in their interest to do so, even though Fauci had already been updated by a bunch of scientists that it likely had come from a lab. They could just look under a microscope and see the fear and cleavage sites, which were the telltale sign. So they knew that this thing likely came from a lab. There was no basis for calling it a conspiracy theory, certainly. And yet the whole field got behind that.
But Sachs, did you see the Slack messages where they were trying to manipulate the New York Times science writer? I mean, they basically...
But the question you have to ask is, why were all these scientists willing to go along with this and sign that letter to the Lancet?
Because these guys have been grinding for 40 or 50 years in a hierarchy. And so to all of a sudden put a pin in it and just say, you know what, I'm going to dispense with all of it. And now I'm going to basically be completely open-minded. How likely was that? The odds of that were very low. Look at the number of people who have basically grown up in one segment of society that are sclerotically in charge of every single leading research university in the United States. That is why we don't have flying cars. This is why. Because after 40 years of working in a specific hierarchy, being rewarded in a very specific way with a very specific set of incentives, when some young, brash, 22-year-old naive person writes an extremely ambitious research proposal, you're like, no, you will not be a part of my lab to do that, but you can do this incremental thing that further reinforces my leadership in society. That is what this chart shows.
If we just pull up this Lancet letter for a second, they say here, zoom in on this, the rapid, open, and transparent sharing of data on this outbreak is now being threatened by rumors and misinformation around its origins. We stand together to strongly condemn conspiracy theories suggesting that COVID-19 does not have a natural origin. How could they say that at that point in time? All the evidence suggested it was made in a lab. Now, certainly, I think you could take the other side of that, but to condemn the lab leak theory as a conspiracy theory, that was corrupt.
I'm not sure that that's corrupt. You know what's corrupt is not retracting that and apologizing. That's where the real corruption is.
We have not gotten our postmortem.
But this Lancet letter was organized. It was organized. This is just like the 51 spies who lied, claiming that the Hunter Biden laptop was disinformation. This is the establishment willing to use its credentials and respectability and expertise to sign a letter they know is false, to perpetrate a fraud on the American people in order to protect the people in charge. That's the motivation here, because Fauci had funded gain-of-function research in the Wuhan lab.
I think the same rot that is in some of these leading research institutions and leading academic institutions and politics, they all share the same commonality, which is we are sclerotic. We are in desperate need of a generational shift of power. And right now, there is no incentive because at the same time, the people that are 70 and 80 are thinking to themselves, well, I'm probably going to live to 100. What should I do for the next 20 years? Being in power is pretty good. Right? So we're in this weird clash.